Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
If you're listening to this podcast, then you're in great company. We've got thousands of listeners who have a thirst for continuous improvement and raising standards in business. Whether your interest is in quality, sustainability, or risk standards, I'd love to welcome you as a member to our online platform for all things ISO, the ISOlogy Hub. The ISOlogy Hub is the leading place to get access to all of your online resources, from in-depth training courses through to our very popular coffee break training, to templates and action plans and many other resources to help raise standards. As a member, you get access to over 100 courses, taking you from learner to practitioner to leader. The ISOlogy Hub has all the resources that you need, which will really help to make your life easier and to help improve compliance in those business critical areas. So if you'd like access to learning and compliance resources ranging from data privacy to environmental management, anti-bribery, business continuity, quality, health and safety, to name just but a few, the list is endless actually, then we'd love for you to come and join us. Just head over to the isologyhub.com. Hi, and welcome to the ISO Show. Well, I've been delighted to be joined on the podcast with Jay Ruckelshaus, who's the co-founder and head of policy and partnerships at Gravity, a carbon and energy management platform. So welcome back, Jay, for the third and final episode on our Platform to Proof series.
So glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, so Jay, you shared some brilliant insights with me on the podcast over the last couple of episodes. So the first one was covering the business drivers for carbon accounting, going back to basics with it in terms of looking at the financial benefits and how organisations can maximise business value and the role that carbon accounting software plays. And then in the second episode, we took a deep dive into how carbon accounting software actually works, the value that it brings, and what the connection is with verification and how that works together for climate compliance. So there's one particular topic that always comes up in conversation. I don't know about you, Jay, but it's always about Scope 3. Do you find that that's one of the top questions that you get asked?
It is. It's sort of where everything comes together. All the anxieties, but all the data, but all the real value. But for sure, hear that from companies.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's one of the biggest headaches for organizations. But when organizations get this right, it can be so powerful. I think the impact of getting this right is just mind blowing, when it is done in the right way. And I know that sometimes it is a little bit like, pulling teeth as an expression, British expression. I don't know if you have that one in the States, but it's definitely a challenge for many organisations. So I'd just like to unpack this first of all by, for some listeners that are tuning into this and they'll be like, okay, so what the hell are value chain emissions?
Right.
Let's just break this down into helping us to understand, what is Scope 3 of value chain greenhouse gas emissions? If you could just try and explain that, please, Jay.
Absolutely. Important to take a step back and especially acknowledging how new a lot of this work is for so many companies. And so this term Scope 3 comes from a document and an initiative called the GHG Protocol, which sort of sets out the core methodology by which companies should measure, account for their greenhouse gas emissions. And it basically encourages companies to break down their emissions into three categories, or what they call scopes, with scope 1 being kind of the most direct emissions of a company has. So things like directly burning fuel in company-owned or controlled equipment, or maybe natural gas burned in company buildings, that sort of thing. Scope 2 is sort of one level out, which is the grid emissions associated with purchased electricity or other forms of energy. So you're buying electricity to produce that electricity somewhere. Maybe there was fuel burned, or maybe it comes from a renewable source. So accounting for the emissions profile kind of upstream of that electricity you're using in your operations. And scope 3 is a really broad term for essentially all of the value chain activities and the emissions associated with those of your company. So there's a couple main categories of that scope 3 source. So things like the upstream emissions of goods that your company purchases. So perhaps you're buying aluminum or, all the inventory that your company purchases. There's emissions upstream associated with the production of those sorts of goods and materials, or capital expenditures is one big category. Another one is things like logistics services you may purchase to transport goods, or the emissions associated with business travel or employee commuting and kind of transportation emissions, or downstream usage of maybe sold products from the company. So if you're selling cars, then the petrol used in those cars. And so it is evident from even that brief description, it's a really diverse kind of cast of characters of the kinds of things companies need to get a handle on measuring. And so consequently, that's, a big source of the initial, frequently overwhelmed feeling of how do we even get started on this? What would be some ways to make this a little bit more tractable and scale from there?
Yeah, and I think that it is a very, very broad area. I think that's an understatement, but
Yeah.
I think what's really interesting to see with many organisations, though, is it's actually the scope 3 that potentially account for 80%, sometimes 90% of their emissions. So it is business critical to be able to capture this.
Yeah.
So why are you seeing, companies measuring their emissions of their value chain partners now?
Exactly. I think three main ones, and that you hit on really the major one there, which is that this is, for a vast majority of companies, the biggest source of their carbon emissions exposure or their footprint is, 60, 70, 80, 90, 95. It's the biggest source of their overall emissions. And so the biggest potential to pose risk to the company, but also opportunities to reduce those emissions. Another big driver, as with carbon accounting in general, is that scope 3 is a requirement for different regulations or quasi-regulatory frameworks. And so, for instance, California reporting about 10,000 companies next year will have to report on the scope 3 footprint of their operations. And in the EU, CSRD, and other regulations elsewhere do require scope 3. So for many, it's no longer optional or quickly won't be. But the third, I think, is it's an interesting sort of overlap with kind of already existing supply chain initiatives or responsible procurement initiatives that many companies have had now for, a decade or two, especially in industries like consumer packaged goods or electronics, or there is a category of industries for whom the notion of understanding not just the sort of financial relationships with their suppliers or their customers, for whom this isn't totally new. And so it's just adding on a different layer of tracking and responsibility and reporting. And so for them, I think that's also been a driver around scope 3 accounting.
I think we've certainly seen a shift in terms of the level of granularity of information that is required now when an organisation's looking to, the so-called greening their supply chain. A number of years ago, it may be a prerequisite to have an environmental policy. But of course, an organisation may just pay lip service to that. We don't actually know if they're actually doing that. It's literally a commitment. And many organisations are still making commitments and pledges. But I think what we're now seeing is the demand to be able to demonstrate with confidence exactly what an organisation's doing in terms of reducing its carbon footprint year on year. So I don't think it's enough now just to say, yes, we're reducing our carbon emissions, or we've got a commitment to, be net zero by 2030, or, well, many organisations now pushing that back to 2050, because obviously we're 2025 now. And I think a lot of organisations are thinking, are we actually going to get there in the next 4 years? And it's a bit of a reality check for a lot of organisations, I think, right now. So, yeah, I think that it's going beyond just making pledges and claims, isn't it? And I think it's the numbers, I think, that are doing the talking when it comes to organisations winning contracts and being commercially competitive. They need to be able to demonstrate exactly what they're doing with quantitative results. So, yeah, so let's say if a company hasn't started to calculate or figure out their scope 3 emissions. They may have just covered 1 and 2, playing it safe. How would you say that companies could get started typically?
Yeah, it's typically the arc we see as well, is maybe getting started with scope 1 and 2 to begin, but then getting onto the scope 3 category next. And I think, as with anywhere in carbon accounting or many business initiatives, we typically recommend not boiling the ocean overnight and starting with everything. And fortunately, as overwhelming as it may sound to start, there are really great on-ramps to beginning a company's scope 3 assessment. And I think the first thing to call out is just like, well, what should we begin to measure? And which of the 15 categories, of which I enumerated a few earlier, like what's actually going to be important and strategic for our business to get a handle on? For some companies, they may not have, raw materials they're purchasing. It may be more of a service-oriented kind of consumer brand or otherwise, or a professional services company, in which case purchase goods and services, they can maybe get away with a higher level measurement to start with. And they may not have a lot of logistics services or upstream transportation to account for. And of course, many companies where those categories are crucial, and the commuting may not be that material. And so we can maybe start then with something higher level. And so really getting a dialed in sense of what's going to be important for our business and where does it make sense to go deeper and what kind of data strategy to have for each of these categories. And which ones can we maybe start with just that industry average approach to, well, we, for example, know we spend $10,000 on raw material purchases, and we can go from there to a rough and ready calculation of what that equates to in terms of emissions, versus a much more specific, well, we're purchasing steel from these facilities in this country, and you can get quite in the weeds. And I think, again, that only makes sense in some categories where it's material for your company, and maybe not all at once in year one. And so thankfully, there are ways to get started that really ease that initial, make that initial on-ramp not so steep. And that always provide outlets and future measurement cycles to get more specific. And of course, specificity is important. I don't want to, just say industry averages all the way, because, it's really hard to sort of track real progress in reduction if you are relying on that more higher level measurement. But it's always a balancing game with, limited resources companies have of what makes sense to double down on versus to not just yet.
And I think that obviously with those key suppliers that you do need to double down on, I think it's really worth investing in the relationship there. And I think this is an interesting dynamic. We've certainly seen this. I'm not sure if you have as well, Jay, in that, initially, let's say an organisation that might have, 1,000 suppliers and they would like to get data from them on their carbon emissions. They might have just sent out a survey to get the information. And, fingers crossed, they might get some information back, but it might just be 5% of the supply chain, and the rest of the requests have just gone ignored. We've seen this shift that's definitely across engagement with the supply chain. And in some cases, interestingly, we had a client, it was a large client in the insurance sector, and they basically had an engagement program. They selected 100 of their suppliers, and they basically had an initiative to support them by providing training and guidance on how to be able to understand what their emissions were, how to be able to report on it, and then how to then submit it back to them. And they invested in that program and took those 100 companies as a sample, just to basically test the water to see how effective that engagement piece would be. And it's early days, by the way, but it will be interesting to see how that pays off, and then how that could potentially be scaled up across the rest of the supply chain. So, I mean, based on your experience, how would you say that supply chain engagement could work in practice, in the cases that you've seen?
It's a great example you just provided, and I think mirrors a lot of the trends we're seeing elsewhere. And as you said, that's typically the first step if you're wanting to get beyond those industry average calculations, is to actually get primary data from suppliers. And historically, this has looked, like you said, of maybe sending an email or a spreadsheet template to suppliers and crossing your fingers that you'll get a maybe single digit or low double digit response rate. I mean, that still is the reality for many companies. And so I think excitingly supplementing that with more scalable ways of getting data about suppliers that minimizes that supplier fatigue. Because I mean, we at Gravity have so much empathy for kind of the other end of the table here, having really started with our product up the value chain with companies who were getting their doors knocked on by their customers for this kind of data. And so we almost took the opposite approach to start, is, intentionally starting with the supplier perspective so we could really make it not only easier for them to measure, but to actually build the empathy for those top-down then engagement programs. And as a consequence of that, that's really fed into our approach here of supplementing various forms of outreach with a couple of things. I mean, one being giving something to suppliers in exchange. So it's not just an extractive kind of, sort of one-way process, but actually giving them value like it sounds like your client is, but helping them measure, giving them easy tools, identifying potentially emissions reduction projects or energy saving projects based on their disclosures. Giving them some value that way is crucial. But there's also another way of almost sidestepping that initial kind of outreach effort to begin with, and using cool tools like AI agents to kind of comb the web in a couple minutes to pull out any public disclosures that companies already made, or other kind of structured database sources like CDP or otherwise to actually piggyback on efforts the company has already done to disclose their emissions or other sustainability or ESG metrics, really to just kind of take the burden off their plate so that they can, get on with the business of their supplier relationship and the kind of, the business of it. And so I think that ends up being a nice release valve too, to really boost those rates at which you can incorporate primary data into your scope 3 footprint without overburdening suppliers or your own team.
Yeah, I think that's just picking up on the AI point, Jay. I think it's fascinating how AI can be used to be able to extract information that's been publicly disclosed, on websites. So I think the more and more organizations are, making those disclosures, and generally verified disclosures as well, the easier it's going to be, isn't it, in terms of being able to extract the information as opposed to making it a more manual process. But on the flip side then, what would you say is in it for the suppliers then within the supply chain?
Yeah, totally. And it is important to have this framing, even from the top-down perspective, even if you've got a really powerful relationship with your suppliers already. I think being conscious of the fact that if you're adding a new set of requirements as part of bids or doing business together, just being conscious of maybe where they are in this maturity sort of stage and whether they've started, whether they're far on the journey, just kind of tailoring I think, supplier engagement strategy to them is really important. I think then there are ways that beyond the kind of like that extractive one-way delivery of information and just asking for something as part of a bid process and then, saying thank you and see you later. There are ways of giving tools to companies wherever they are on that maturity curve to either help them get started with measurement if they haven't before, allowing them to use some of maybe the same accounting or automation tools that you yourself may be using as a bigger company downstream, down the value chain. To also, I think, connecting the dots to the business value for these kind of companies that, look, yes, you're going to need to start measuring or disclosing emissions because it's important for our procurement program, but also because it may help you. And here are ways to connect the dots across the measurement and reporting process to the project scoping and project identification process to maybe save money on your energy bills or save consumption in other ways. So being creative too. I mean, we've even seen some companies do really exciting co-financing programs where they've got some particularly heavy emitting suppliers. They've been able to help them identify and even co-finance ways of reducing those up the value chain. And of course, the big company benefits too in the form of a lower scope 3 footprint. And it can end up being a really powerful win-win situation.
Yeah, I was in a meeting the other day with an organisation. They were excluded from the category of like the CSRD, so like 22 million GBP turnover a year, less than 100 employees. And this is a key supply chain requirement for them in terms of reporting on their scopes 1 and 2 and 3 and getting verified. And it actually enabled them to look much more closely at their business operations. What fuel was one of the biggest costs. And what they did was basically take a really close look at that to identify, okay, so where are our potential cost savings? How can we optimize the routes in terms of, delivery of goods? If we then switch our fleet of vehicle, to EV, hybrid, what's the potential cost saving of that? And it was only really by being forced on their reporting when they realised what their carbon emissions were that they identified that actually there were some significant financial benefits. And as a smaller business, the difference in terms of the bottom line and profitability can be pretty significant, especially when you're looking at that year on year. And also if they're an organisation that's scaling up as well. So yes, I think we've definitely seen, although it may be a supply chain requirement, it's not a mandatory, regulatory requirement for some SMEs, smaller businesses. By being forced to look at the numbers in more detail, they are actually seeing some significant cost savings, which I think is great to see.
Yeah.
So just final question for you, Jay. Obviously, we've been talking about Scope 3 emissions and reporting and compliance in this episode, but if an organisation's been reporting on Scopes 1 and 2, but are feeling quite daunted about Scope 3, how could carbon accounting software, a platform like Gravity, potentially help them?
It's a great question. I think a couple areas. So one is just getting from scratch to a really rough and ready assessment of what are going to be the hotspots worth doubling down on to really calibrate that strategy. And here, Gravity's built a lot of clever tools that can take kind of raw inventory or other kind of purchase files, logistics files, really just any raw exports from your systems or business data to go immediately to a hotspot analysis and get that initial calculation and really cut out a lot of the steps there. But then when you're ready to advance in any of the categories of Scope 3 measurement, like logistics or business travel or purchase materials, to really then go and give you the full end-to-end tools to do things like comb the web, get supplier-specific information with AI agent tools, or directly reach out to suppliers with supply chain engagement and diligent tools, and centralize that all back in to inform that Scope 3 accuracy and for the categories that are really material for your business. And then finally, of course, to put it in the format needed for reporting and disclosure. So at each step really of that maturity curve, understanding that there can be points of leverage and ways of making what can sometimes be an overwhelming seeming process a bit more tractable.
Jay, I'd just like to say a huge thank you. Really thank you for all of the advice and guidance you've been sharing with us over the last 3 episodes on the ISO show and our series on Platform to Proof. I've certainly learned quite a lot from you as well during this conversation and thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. So yeah, I'd just like to say a big thank you on behalf of myself and all of our ISO show listeners.
Oh, such a pleasure, Mel. So pleased to be here and excited to keep working with all the great verifiers at Carbonology and excited to remain in touch.
Yeah, so if our listeners would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way to reach out to you?
Of course, I think maybe 2 ways. One is just our normal website, which is gravityclimate.com. Great source of the major initiatives and areas of work that we perform with companies. And also just my personal email is jay, J-A-Y, at gravityclimate.com. And be glad to speak with any listeners.
Fantastic. Yeah. So if you've got any questions for Jay, then please don't hesitate to get in contact with him directly. He's been very generous with his time today, and I'm sure he'd be happy to answer any questions that you've got in relation to the topic that we've been covering over the last 3 episodes. I'd just like to remind everybody, if you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, if you've taken away, an aha or some type of light bulb moment, or it's provided some information for you that will be useful to take back, to the workplace, then please do like and share the podcast wherever you've been listening to it, on whichever media player. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because that also helps us to get out to a wider audience, and so more people can benefit from the insights that, for example, that Jay shared with us today. So thanks very much for listening to us today and on the previous 2 episodes if you've tuned in. If you've missed either of those, I do recommend to go back and listen to those, because it's been quite a nice lead through from Platform to Proof. So thanks once again. I'll stop waffling now for you to join us on the last 3 episodes, and look forward to catching up with you on the next episode of the ISO show.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.